The night the bishop's buggy pulled into our lane, I was already shaking, and I had not yet done a single thing wrong. I was 20 years old. I had been married to Amos for 4 months, and I stood at the kitchen window watching that black buggy come up the dirt road in the blue evening light, and I knew what it meant. A bishop does not visit your home for coffee. A bishop visits to inspect, to see whether the household you have built is in line with the ordinong. And I, the new wife, the youngest woman in that house, was the thing being inspected. Before I tell you what Amos demanded of me after the bishop left that night, and I need you to understand it was not a request, it was a demand he believed was his right, let me tell you who I am. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small district in Wayne County, Ohio, and this is Hannah, the Amish girl, the channel where I tell you the things we were taught to carry to our graves in silence. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, not the postcards, not the tourist buggies, subscribe and tap that like button. And in the comments, tell me, before today, did you even know a bishop could enter your home unannounced and judge whether your marriage was righteous? I want to know what brought you here. Now let me explain what a bishop's visit actually is, because the word visit does it no justice at all. In my district, the bishop held a kind of authority that is difficult to describe to anyone raised in the outside world. He was not only the spiritual head, he was the interpreter of the ordinong, our unwritten code, the one that governs everything from the width of your hat brim to the way a husband and wife are meant to live behind a closed door. There is no book you can read it from. It lives in his mouth and in the memory of the elders. And when the bishop comes to a young couple's home in those first months of marriage, he comes to make certain the household is ordered correctly, that the wife is submitting, that the husband is leading, that nothing worldly has crept under the roof. I had cleaned that house for 2 days. I scrubbed the floorboards on my knees until my back screamed. I took down every calendar, hid the small battery clock my cousin had given me, made sure not one thing in that home could be called proud or fancy or worldly. Amos walked through every room behind me, checking my work, and twice he made me redo a thing I had already done well. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Because a bishop's disapproval does not fall on the wife alone. It falls on the husband as the head of the house. And Amos was being judged that night just as surely as I was. Here is what most people watching this do not understand about an Amish marriage in those early months. The husband is not simply your partner. He has become, in the eyes of the church, your covering, your authority, the one who answers for you. When you are baptized and married, and I was both, you pass from your father's headship into your husband's. There is a word for it that the bishop used in his sermons. Submission. A wife submits. And the bishop's visit was, more than anything, a test of whether that submission had taken root in me yet. The buggy stopped. I heard the horse breathing in the cold. I heard the bishop's boots on the porch, slow and heavy, and beside him, the lighter step of his wife, because a bishop does not visit a young couple without bringing his own wife along for propriety. Amos opened the door, and his voice changed entirely. It went soft and deferent, a voice I had never heard from him in 4 months of marriage. Bishop Yoder, welcome to our home. We sat in the front room on the hard benches. I served coffee and the choufle pie I had baked that morning, and I kept my eyes down the way I had been taught, the way a young wife shows she knows her place. The bishop's wife studied me. She studied the seams of my dress, the pins in my prayer cap, the cleanliness of my hands. The bishop asked Amos about the farm, about his father, about whether we were attending every preaching. And then, almost gently, he began to ask about us, about our marriage, whether I was a help to my husband, whether I was content in my duties, whether, and he said this looking at Amos, never at me, whether the household was being kept in the order the Lord requires. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts, everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordinong They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is this. The bishop spoke to Amish for a long time about headship, about a husband's duty to lead his wife in all things, and a wife's duty to yield. He quoted the old words. He spoke of the marriage bed as something ordained, something owed within the covenant, a duty as much as a blessing. He said a wife who withholds herself from her husband withholds from the Lord's design. And he said it plainly, in front of me, in front of his own wife, as if it were the most ordinary instruction in the world. Because to them it was. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, and my face burning, and I understood for the first time exactly what kind of marriage I had been baptized into. I had thought, in my girlish way, that the closeness between a husband and wife was a private thing that belonged only to the two of us. I was learning that night that in my world it belonged to the church. It was a matter of doctrine. And the bishop had just reminded my husband, in my own front room, that it was his right. I want to be honest about Amish here, because the truth is more complicated than the title of this video. He was not a monster. He was 23 years old. He could break a team of horses and frame a barn and quote scripture for an hour, and he was just as shaped by that room as I was. Maybe more, because everything the bishop said to him, he had already been told 100 times growing up, and now it was being confirmed in front of his new wife. A husband leads, a wife yields, the bed is owed. He absorbed it the way a field absorbs rain. The bishop and his wife stayed nearly 2 hours. When they finally rose to leave, the bishop laid his hand on Amish's shoulder at the door and said something quietly that I was not meant to hear, but I heard it. He said, "See that your house is in order, brother. All of it." And then the black buggy rolled back down the lane, and the lamplight swallowed the last of it, and we were alone in that quiet house, my husband and I, with the weight of everything that had just been said still hanging in the air like wood smoke. Stay with me, because what happened in the next hour is the reason I am still telling this story all these years later. It is the reason I left. It is the thing I have never said out loud to anyone except a therapist in a small office 2 states away from where I was born. Amish turned to me in the kitchen. The lamp was low. I was washing the coffee cups, my back to him, and I could feel him standing behind me, and the air in the room had changed. He said my name, Martha. And then he told me what the bishop's words had meant. He told me that it was his right, confirmed by the church that very night, and that a wife who understood her place would not need to be asked twice. He did not raise his voice. That is the part that has stayed with me for all these years. He was not angry. He was certain. He had been handed his certainty by a man in a black hat who had just driven away into the dark, and now he was holding it out to me as though it were simple, as though it were obvious, as though my own feelings about it were a thing that did not enter into the matter at all. And here is what nobody outside my world will understand unless I say it plainly. I did not have the words to refuse. I want you to sit with that. It was not that I was forbidden to say no exactly. It was that no one had ever taught me that no was a thing a wife was permitted to feel, let alone say. I had been raised from birth to believe that my own wants were the smallest and least important things in any room. That a good woman empties herself. That submission is not just an action, but a state of the heart, and that to resist your husband on the very night the bishop has reminded him of his headship was not only disobedience to Amish, it was rebellion against God. So I dried my hands. And I did not say no, because I did not know that I could. And that, more than anything Amish did, is the thing I grieve. My friend Rebecca married a year before I did. We grew up 2 farms apart, and we whispered to each other the way Amish girls do, in the gaps between chores, in the dark corners of quilting frolics. After her own bishop's visit, she told me something I did not understand at the time. She said, "Now it begins." And she would not explain what she meant. I understood it later. She meant that the visit was the moment the church formally placed her marriage, every private corner of it, under the authority of men who would never have to live inside it. She endured that marriage for 11 years. She is still inside it. I am not. It took me 2 more years to leave. 2 years of mornings that began at 4:30, of feeding animals and baking bread and carrying a silence inside me that grew heavier every single day. And the silence was the worst of it. Because I could not name what was wrong, I had no vocabulary for it. In my world there was no word for consent, because consent assumes you have a choice, and a wife who has been taught she has no self has nothing to consent with. There was no word for coercion, because coercion assumes that pressure is wrong, and in my world that pressure was called marriage. It was called the ordinong. It was called the will of God. When I finally left, the cost was immediate and total, the way it always is. The shunning came down within weeks. My letters home were returned unopened. My mother would not speak to me on the telephone in the English neighbor's kitchen where I called from, weeping. My father's door closed and has never opened again. I traded an entire world, every person I had ever loved, for the right to a self I was not sure I even had yet. It was in a small therapist's office, years later, that I first heard the words spoken aloud that changed everything: autonomy, consent, coercion, bodily authority. I sat in that chair and I wept, not from the pain itself but from the recognition that there had been other ways to live, other ways to be a woman, that had been kept from me as deliberately as a locked door. My therapist said something I have carried every day since. She said, "Martha, a thing is not consent simply because no one screamed. Sometimes the loudest no in the world is the one a woman was never taught she was allowed to say." I do not tell you this story to make you hate the Amish. I want to be clear about that. The world I came from gave me real things. A community that showed up for every birth and every burial. Hands that knew how to do 100 honest kinds of work. A faith that, even now wounded and rebuilt and changed almost past recognizing, is still somewhere inside me. But there is no scripture that makes a woman the property of the church. There is no ordinong worth the silence it demanded of me. And there is no God I am willing to believe in now who built a woman with a will and a voice and a self, and then ordained that she spend her marriage pretending she had none of them. The bishop drove away that night believing he had set my house in order. He had. He had ordered it exactly the way generations of men before him had ordered it, with the wife folded down small and the husband certain of his rights, and the whole arrangement blessed from a hard wooden bench and called holy. That is the order I was raised inside. That is the order I broke. And breaking it cost me everything I had, and I would pay it again tomorrow without a single moment of hesitation. If you grew up in a world where your silence was called obedience, where no one ever told you that your own no was a thing you were allowed to feel, I see you. If you were ever made to believe that your body belonged to anyone but you, to a husband, to a church, to a man in a black hat who drove away into the dark and left someone else to enforce his words, I see you too. You were not wrong for what you felt. You were only never given the language for it. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordinong they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.